Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about two rhetorical elements that I tend to think of as interconnected, and that's Kairos and Exigence. And the reason I tend to think of these as interconnected is because they both deal with why it's important to write a particular, or to speak a particular rhetorical act. So Kairos, basically the way that you want to think about Kairos is timeliness. So the central question with Kairos is, why is this important now? Why does this subject matter right now? And then with Exigence, this is more of your motivation or your personal stake in the issue. So why should you be the one to write or speak about this topic? So these are important rhetorical elements, and actually these are important things to think about when you yourself are writing. The timeliness of this subject and why you should be the one to write about it. But these are also important things to know about when you're doing a project like a rhetorical analysis or evaluation. So I want to start from that side when you're thinking about this from an analytical or evaluative perspective, and then later I'm going to talk about why these are important to think about with your own writing. So when you're doing a rhetorical analysis or evaluation, the Kairos and Exigence are important to think about because they tell you about the historical context in which a piece of rhetoric comes about, and they tell you about the author's credentials. So there's an ethos connection here, right? Because ethos, if you've watched my video on rhetorical appeals, ethos is the author's credibility. And what goes along with that is their ethics. So are they a good moral person? But also their reliability, their reasons for wanting to make this rhetorical act, their reasons for wanting to say or write whatever it is. Those are ethos concerns. So you build credibility by being timely and by having relevant personal stakes and relevant personal authority to speak on this subject. So if we think about, for instance, one of the most famous pieces of rhetoric in U.S. history, Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. What's the Kairos for this? What's the timeliness for this? Well, it occurs during the midst of the civil rights movement, and so that's one major element of Kairos. It's timely because it's a pro-civil rights speech during the midst of the civil rights movement. And that may seem like a fairly obvious assessment, but that's actually important historical context. Similarly, it occurs during the March on Washington. And so this is another Kairos element. It occurs at a specific time, a specific event, and that event is what outside in the world. And that's actually a good way to think about Kairos as well, is that it's the thing in the world that prompts a particular piece of rhetoric. So the civil rights movement is a larger Kairos context. The March on Washington is the smaller, more immediate Kairos context. These are the things that prompt King to make the speech. Then if we look at Exigence, what motivates him and what are his qualifications that make him the right person to speak about this subject? Well, he had been involved with the civil rights movement for over a decade by that point. Like he had been a major organizer. He was one of the leading figures of the civil rights movement. He was nationally famous, etc., etc. So all of these things are And obviously he had a deep personal investment in the cause of civil rights. So all of these things are elements of what made King the right person for the job, so to speak, the right person to make this speech. This is the Kairos, Civil Rights Movement, March on Washington, and the Exigence, King's personal stake in the Civil Rights Movement and his qualifications as a civil rights leader. So, if we're thinking about this in an analytical or evaluative perspective, these are the kinds of considerations we want to make when we're thinking about Kairos and Exigence. And this is part of the larger scope of what we call the rhetorical situation, which I've done a video on rhetorical situation before. And again, this is broadly speaking the entire context in which a speech act or writing act occurs. When you're thinking about your own writing, you want to think also about Kairos and Exigence. And again, part of this has to do with credibility. But so when I was in my doctoral program at West Virginia University, we had to take a course on research methods and basically like development of professional scholarly writing techniques. And one of the things that the professor told us in that course that I think is really quite important is that even as a professional scholar who has a distinct focus, you need to be thinking about why the subject you're writing on matters right now. So the example I always use in my writing classes when I'm teaching Kairos is if in 2021 you wanted to write something arguing that Austria should take revenge for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, you have missed your moment of Kairos. And for those of you who don't know what that reference means, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Serbia in 1914 is essentially what kicked off World War I. Now, there is no good reason to write an argument that Austria should take revenge. It simply wouldn't make any sense. The timeliness of that moment is gone. So that's one thing that you want to be thinking about is anyone interested in reading this argument or hearing this argument at this particular time? So we think about, and this is actually one thing that you as a writer can do, you as a speaker can do. You think about in what ways might this be important now? So I'll give you another example. I'm currently working on a book chapter about an Egyptian play from 1970. Who cares in 2021? Well, the reason that this still has Kairos, the reason that this is still relevant is because the play, in my argument, anyway, in my reading of it, has to do with democracy. And in 2021, there are increasing problems. There are increasing numbers of people who are losing faith in democracy. And so in 2021, this continues to be relevant, not necessarily directly because Ali Salim's The Comedy of Oedipus is still important, but because the ideas that the play are working through remain important. And so by establishing that in the chapter itself, I can actually show readers why they should continue to be concerned about this. So that's one benefit of thinking about Kairos for your own writing. The other thing that you want to think about with your own writing is exigence. Why should I write about this? Why should I be the person who makes this argument? And one of the big reasons I would say that you should think about exigence is because sometimes the answer is that you shouldn't. So, for instance, I am a cisgendered male. I don't necessarily have a stake in abortion. It's not something that I'm ever going to have to choose to have or not have. And so maybe I should not be the person who writes in favor of a particular abortion law or in opposition to a particular abortion law. Maybe that's something that I don't have enough of a stake in. That's something to consider. Now, the other sort of argument about that, and I don't want to make this specifically about abortion, but this principle applies to a lot of different debates. The other potential argument about that may be that because I don't have a stake directly in it, but I have a position of privilege in our patriarchal society, that I may have, say, an obligation to speak on the issue to try and use my influence as an ally. I don't want to go further with that discussion, but this is part of the idea, is when you're thinking about exigence, you want to think about, should I be speaking about this? Am I the right person? You want to be, and one of the, a lot of these questions in terms of exigence are similar to the questions you would be thinking about with ethos. Do I have the authority to speak about this? Do I have credentials that are relevant to this discussion? Am I a good representative for the particular position, etc., etc.? And the thing is, we each have exigence for things. There are things that impel us as individuals to write or speak about particular subjects, and there are particular subjects that we as individuals are qualified to speak on and less qualified to speak on. And so you want to be very conscious of your position relative to this issue.